Hi, I'm John Paul and a really warm welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video about a couple of things. It's a continuation of the video which I did previously about things I wish I knew before I became a therapist. So things that it would have been helpful to have known back when I started, I guess. Two things that I'm going to talk about today. The first of them is looking at working with difference. I got a question that came from somebody, a subscriber through YouTube, asking about that. What's it like working with people with different worldviews? They use the example specifically of religion, spirituality. So I'll talk about that a bit specifically, but generally I thought it would be helpful as well to look at working with people, as I say, with different worldviews, whatever that might mean. So I'm going to look at that and then also talk about the second thing, which is responsibility as a therapist. You know, what I would see as my responsibility as a therapist. The reason for that is when I first started, I remember somebody saying early on in the training that a particular well-known therapist had said that if a client leaves therapy, then that's always the therapist's responsibility. I can't remember the quote exactly, but I remember that stayed with me and gave some anxiety, I suppose. And I just think it's an interesting thing to look at, which is what is our responsibility as a therapist? You know, what's the client's part? What's our part in any disconnection or perhaps an ending too? So I thought that's a helpful thing, as I say, to look at. And also it feeds into another question which somebody asked, a YouTube subscriber asked about the idea of deliberate practice and its applicability to psychotherapy and being a therapist. I hadn't heard of deliberate practice before, but now I've looked into it. I think it's a really interesting idea. So I wanted to say something about that as well. But it falls into the realm, I think, of responsibility as a therapist, as you'll see. So I'm going to talk about that as well. Just before I go on to talk about those two things, just to say the next video I'm going to be recording in this sort of format is a continuation of video about letting go of a known sort of previous career and moving into the unknown. If you've watched the first video, that was much more about ease and sort of trust of self and others, but also, as I said in that video, from the point of view of the kind of effort side of things, I do think there are things practically that we can do to help to make that process easier. Also ways that we can think, which I would have found helpful as well. So I'm going to do a video on that next. And also I'm recording the podcast with Annalisa Barbieri sort of mid-February as well. So I shall put that up as soon as that's done. Just generally with this, of course, as ever, if you find the video helpful, please do give it a like. That would be great. I'd love to hear any of your comments on anything that I'm talking about, views, opinions, comments. Please do post them below the video. I'll try and reply to all of them. Also, if you just want to message me separately, please do feel free to do that as well via email, via the website too. Please subscribe if you haven't already to the channel as well. Okay, so moving into the two issues. The first one, as I say, is that issue about what's it like working with people with different worldviews. So difference, really. In no particular order, there's a number of things that would come up about that for me. As I say, specifically the person that asked the question talked about spirituality and religion, which may be a particular issue for them. It may be a particular issue in terms of where they practice. So I will say a little bit about that specifically as well. Generally, though, I can see that, you know, working with difference is a very significant thing. It's interesting for people coming into the profession. It's going to occur to a lot of people as well as a potential issue. Because I think if we're looking at a therapeutic relationship, what we need is more often than not is to maintain a connected relationship with someone. Of course, disconnection, you know, you'll be walking along together most of the time, but sometimes things will come apart. And it's at those times that, you know, the repair, they can be very important times, and the repair actually is a very, very helpful thing for clients and in terms of the therapeutic relationship as well. But I think we're probably all aware that that those sort of differences in values, worldviews, opinions, if they're not repaired, or if people can't see eye to eye, that they could be a potential situation where there is a disconnection. So they could sort of adversely affect that and the therapeutic relationship. So I can see why they are particular issues and concerns for people. Equally, I think it's important to acknowledge that all therapists have their own worldviews about things, have their own perspectives about how they see themselves in the world. They'll potentially have political views, potentially sort of spiritual, religious beliefs, whatever it might be. So this idea that therapists are blank slates, there are some therapists who very much advocate that and will be like that in front of clients, but fundamentally I think it is two human beings in a room in terms of therapy, and as I say, therapists will hold their own views about things. So what happens if those views, that sort of frame, the therapist frame, bumps up against the client's frame? I mean, just to say generally about difference, I think it's one of the most, the reasons that I enjoy the role so much is that there is that difference with clients. You know, I could see a number of clients a day, but it flies past because there is that difference, different ways of looking at the world, different jobs, experiences, people telling their stories in that way. The situations where I would say differences can cause a bit of a difficulty or there is something to look at, is where there is something being talked about which I might perceive to be harmful psychologically, physically to the client or others around them, and also potentially things that may be unhelpful for them, again, in terms of the sort of paradigm that I would be looking at. So examples of that, you know, from my point of view, would not be a religious belief or a spiritual belief or a political belief. But if you've heard the other videos that I've had before, I think if there's sort of a dominance of protectiveness for somebody, there's good reason for them protecting themselves in that way. But if that is dominant, fear and anger, that can disconnect them from self and the world, kind of can distort our perception of self and the world. It also, that part of drive, the needing to be better than, less than, seeing the world in that way, if that part is very dominant, again, superior, inferior, can be disconnecting. So if there are things that are happening, the way the client's talking, experiencing themselves in the world, which represent that to me when I'm listening to it, and perhaps it would be helpful for more energy, in my view, to go into that place of, you know, sort of connection with self and others, whilst protecting themselves, whilst also, you know, having that part of competitiveness and comparisons, which is very human too. You know, that will be a situation where I think you can see the client's worldview might sort of nudge up against mine. You know, in that situation, I think what's really helpful to hold in mind is that I wouldn't either sort of look away from it completely. That might sound like, you know, collusion or being a bit too fearful to say something from my point of view or acknowledge it. Neither would, so I wouldn't do this, I wouldn't turn away, and neither would I jump on it. And what might that look like? I suppose that could look like getting annoyed or saying to somebody that I think their view is problematic. What is that place in the middle? I would say I would describe that as sort of this place, I suppose. It's that place of aliveness to it. It would be the place of empathy, fundamentally, that whatever view and belief the client's developed, it's developed absolutely for a reason. If you're looking at those very protective parts of self, if genders, sexualities have been othered, that is the sort of a dominant fear part of self, which would have developed for a reason for that part based on somebody's history. So I think to sort of jump on it and say that's the wrong thing to think, butt up against in that way, is going to be unhelpful. I think equally to look away and ignore it isn't something that I would do either. So that place of aliveness, the qualities that would be there, I suppose, that sort of place, that face-to-face relationship, more aliveness to it. It would be, you know, empathy, trying to understand where the client's coming from and why it is the case that these beliefs and things have developed without shaming somebody, without being kind of accusatory. So empathy is a quality of this place. I think curiosity is a quality of this place too, and absolutely listening. And I think you can represent that also when I did a video on boundaries, which is on this channel actually. In relation to boundaries, what I said in that, it could be represented. We don't want, I think, generally boundaries that are always saying stop to people, and neither, I think, in most cases, do we want boundaries which are always completely open. So actually, in most cases, what is most helpful in relationship is to have the capacity to say no at times if that's what we need, and also very much the capacity to be open and receptive to whatever's coming in. And I suppose that's you can use that, I think, that sort of visual representation in relation to this place about difference too. As I say, if from my point of view that difference may be, say, unhelpful or harmful physically, psychologically to that person or another person, more often than not, if somebody is doing something which, is, for example, harmful to themselves, they will be in conflict about it anyway. So there will be a part that's saying, well, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And there will also be a part probably that's saying, that may not be in my best interest, and I do understand that. So some, sort of self-awareness and observation part, perhaps deeper down, that is looking at sort of self-care there. And in that situation, I think what is really helpful, we can put energy into and get the person to talk from the part, which is about, say, continuing with the behaviour that might be dangerous, and also to talk from the part that would like to stop the behaviour and what that part might say. So again, really, it's not a matter of me saying anything there. The client will be doing that themselves. I think the difficulty can be is if somebody is sort of really invested in a behaviour that to me would seem dangerous to themselves or others. And in that situation, I think there would be there is an internal part of me that would notice that would be something that I would be saying, oh, I'm not sure about that. Equally, it would come with this, which is, why don't you tell me all about it? Let's be curious about it. Let's look at what's happening. Let's look at why those beliefs are developed. And then somebody can absolutely, of course, choose to continue to believe whatever they want to believe. It is not for me to change somebody else's experience. In terms of therapy, I would look at it as, that we're looking at bricks in somebody's life. We will take out a brick, look at it. If it works for them, they believe it works for them, then we put it back. If they take something out and we look at it and we think it could be unhelpful in some way, then we can look at a preferred alternative. So as I say, qualities-wise, which is the thing that works in most relationships, I think what it is about empathy, it is about curiosity, and it's also about, I think, boundaries, that the fact that I do have my own values and opinions based on experience of being a therapist, and that I will hold those and, where necessary, express them to a client too. Just going on, the position of jumping on something and getting annoyed about it or setting up some sort of confrontational situation. I think the difficulty with that, well, I think we could all understand the difficulty with that from the point of view of an ongoing therapeutic relationship with somebody. But, aside from the fact it wouldn't work well, I don't think from the point of view of a therapeutic relationship and the continuation of that and the sort of trust and openness and honesty that's needed in that. I think that nobody ever sort of adapted a view by somebody else telling them that there was something wrong with them. A lot of the time when people all of the time really, when people develop views which seem to say others, based on fear and anger, that part, in order to no longer do that, that part needs something else to hand over to. If we've gone through life helping ourselves to feel better by othering other people, by imagining ourselves as superior in some ways, as I say, that's disconnecting, I believe unhelpful. If that's a consistent pattern of behaviour for somebody needs something else to hand over to. We will not hand over protection, safety, and we will not hand over a sense of superiority, inferiority, unless we have something else in place that's going to keep us safe, that's going to keep us feeling good, that's going to be a more helpful way of navigating relationships with ourselves and the world. And I absolutely believe that therapy is the place that can build that other place and put more energy into it, that place much more of making sure that we have protection when we need it, against perhaps an individual that can use the sort of competitiveness of life to drive us through it. But fundamentally, life is about a much more connected experience with ourselves and others generally. Just a few other things to say here. Some people may be offended, some therapists may be offended by ongoing views of a client. Just to say very briefly here, we don't have to work with anybody that we don't want to work with. There are all kinds of things there around sort of, ethically what that means, talking to supervisors, etc. But I think that is a principle that's important to hold in mind too. In my experience, generally, that's never been the case. If that is something that you've experienced, it would be interesting to hear what that was like for you. From my point of view, it doesn't tend to be kind of political views, religious views, those kind of things that would cause the difficulty in relationship with those. For me, it would always be looking at them, as I say, with empathy, with curiosity, and holding in mind my frame, which would be, is that a dominance of fear? Is that a dominance of anger, which might be unhelpful for the client? Is that a sense of superiority, inferiority, dominating, which again might be unhelpful? The thing that I would say in terms of worldview that would cause, some difficulty in the relationship are the kinds of things that I talked about in my video about men in overdrive, those sorts of qualities. And if you have a listen to that video about the things that can be obstacles to connection, to relationships, sort of ways of seeing another person, I think those things for me are more disconnecting and potentially more problematic if you're looking at a therapeutic relationship than necessarily what somebody's religious or political views are. Just going on to look specifically at religion and spirituality, because that's what somebody asked about. From my point of view, it doesn't come up that often. Again, it would be interesting to hear your experience. I was talking to a therapist who is in another part of the world, and they're in a part of the world that's particularly a state that's particularly religious. So a client will often ask what their religion is. It isn't the case that would come up that often with the people that I see. I suppose if it did come up again, if we're looking at that sort of frame that I might have about, protection, about the sort of drives and superiority and connection, to the extent that spiritual or religious beliefs are about connection, which a lot of them are, about love, about forgiveness, about helping others, to the extent that it's about that, those appear to me to be very connecting behaviours. Sometimes, of course, I think religion is brought in to do the superiority, inferiority thing with other people. Sometimes it's also brought into the part that's about protection and fear and anger in relation to others as well. So I suppose from my point of view, I would pay attention to that, but it hasn't particularly come up. I suppose a couple of times it has sort of nudged against that connection with self, with others, in the context specifically, for example, that somebody may have a concept of original sin, and that we are fundamentally flawed, and the way that sits with, I suppose, my ideas about having a grounded sense of our worth and value, those two have nudged up against each other in the past. Similarly, a belief, I guess, that I would have about taking responsibility, taking care of ourselves, that being our primary responsibility, and to take care of dependence as well. How that works with, say, God, if that's what somebody believes first, then others next, and then me. Again, those two can sort of nudge up against each other. It'd be interesting to see the relationship between the two of them. But again, it's something to be curious about, empathise with, and just to notice in the room. Just to finish off, in terms of spirituality, religion, I know people that specifically, of course, they will advertise themselves, so to speak, on the basis of their spirituality. There are therapists who talk about being kind of spiritual coaches. So if it is something that's very important to someone, then they can make that part of what they show to the outside world. Similarly, with kind of worldviews, political worldviews, there are therapists on Twitter, for example, who make it very clear what their political views are about things. They would describe themselves as activists. They will comment on any current political issue. That wouldn't be something that I would do, but if that is something that, where you are and where you want to be in life as a therapist, I think to put those views out on Twitter, I imagine they bring clients through who kind of share those views. So if these issues, sort of political, spirituality, are very important, I just think it's interesting to notice the fact that some people now, with these sort of social media platforms, and of course our profiles on the internet and directories, we can make that very clear to people, and somebody might choose to do that. They might make these things very clear to kind of attract or draw certain people with a shared worldview there. And I think that's an interesting idea. It might be interesting to hear what you think about that too. So that's just to finish off on working with difference. There are lots of other things that come up around it, lots of other things that I could talk about, but from a timing point of view, that's as much as I will say. Just moving on to the second point, which is about what I would consider, I suppose, my responsibility as a therapist. And it comes from this idea, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, about what happens, an ending. There can be a tendency either it's quite a binary way of looking at it, for the therapist to say on every occasion, it is my responsibility, that was my fault, so to speak, not that I like that word, or there are therapists, definitely, there can be a feel of saying, well, if ever a client leaves or something's not quite working the way that it might in the therapeutic relationship, that's fundamentally always the client's resistance. They have, too many obstacles to relationship, and that's kind of on them. So, and I think that's very helpful to look at and to notice here, and to look at where we are on that. As far as responsibility, I would say I think I can identify three main responsibilities. I would say the first one of those is to make sure that I'm in a place, more often than not, that is conducive to what I offer, which would be a connected therapeutic relationship with somebody else. So making sure that professionally, personally, I'm in a place that I can do that, and that takes in lots of things: thoughts, feeling, body, behavior, relationships with others. But I think primarily that is my responsibility, to make sure that so far as possible I am in a place that I can do that, because only when I'm in that place, I suppose, going back to what I was saying earlier about not doing this and not jumping on something, to be in that place of empathy, sort of aliveness, honesty, being able to hold boundaries, to know, who I am, and be able to attune to the client. I think that requires a therapist to be in a particular place. So I think it is my responsibility, as often as I can, of course we're all human, but to try and make sure that that is what I'm doing, who I'm being. The second one, I think, there is the responsibility to comply with ethical requirements that we have. I wouldn't go into them in detail here, but I think it's important to hold that in mind. I was having a look at the ethical codes recently of UKCP, lots of interesting things in there that are very helpful. I can understand why they're there. And I think, when clients come to registered therapists, they come to BACP, UKCP accredited or registered therapists, then there will be an expectation we will be working in line with those codes of ethics. So I do think that's my responsibility as well, to make sure that is the case as far as possible. Thirdly, and really importantly, and then that brings me on to this idea about deliberate practice, is this idea about ongoing professional and personal development. And I do think I would see that as my responsibility as well. I suppose it can be easy, so to speak, to stay in the same place as a therapist. I mean, we are changing all the time anyway, but in this world, one of the most wonderful things about it is that there are lots of new kind of techniques and ideas coming through all the time. And I think I don't think it's possible to be familiar with all of them and be able to do all of them, so to speak, but definitely I think it's my responsibility to keep learning from other people, keep interested in the profession and ideas, keep challenging myself as well. So I would say that I think that is my responsibility. That's, sort of from a professional development point of view, also from a personal development point of view. And then in terms of deliberate practice, as I say, that can come in here as well, I think. I hadn't heard of the idea before, but a subscriber wrote about it and said, what about the applicability of it to therapy? So I looked into it, and the idea of deliberate practice is that it's a focused effort aimed at pushing your ability beyond what it is at present, targeting areas of weakness. So if you're looking at that kind of professional development side of things, I think the idea that I would be putting a focused effort into pushing my ability beyond what it is, I guess becoming a better therapist, whatever that might be, I think that's a very helpful idea to be holding in mind. You'd probably say that the ongoing requirements, and therapists will do it anyway, for continuing professional development are for that reason, to make sure that is something that's happening. The interesting thing here, for me personally, was that what it says is that it's often about targeting areas of weakness. So I think deliberate practice is often, more familiarly used in, for example, sports people who are trying to, who are focusing their effort on improving their performance. And the way they do that is by looking at ways in which they might have a weakness. So a tennis player, for example, with their backhand. And that's where, for me, it does get interesting in terms of kind of professional development, because I think a lot of therapists, including myself, will tend to engage in professional development and go towards that professional development that we're interested in. Now, that might be because on some level we're conscious or aware that we might not be as good at something as perhaps we could be. So it may be taking care of itself there. But I would say generally that I don't hear therapists talk that much about their weaknesses in things. In fact, I was listening to a podcast on this subject. It's really interesting. There's a guy called Noel Bell who trained where I trained, actually, and he has a podcast on the applicability of deliberate practice to psychotherapy. So if you Google Noel Bell deliberate practice, and he's talking to a guy, I can't remember the guy's surname, but Dr. Scott's his first name, and who's looked into this. And he said a couple of things which I thought were interesting. The first of which is that therapists often believe that they are getting better over time with experience, and it isn't necessarily the case. Secondly, he says that some therapists are 10 times more effective than others in terms of studies. And I don't know, again, whether as between therapists we would necessarily be that conscious or aware of that. So what he's advocating, I guess, is looking at on a kind of statistics basis and studies basis to say that some are better than others, therapists, and that there are ways of improving our performance as therapists. And one of those ways primarily is by looking at the things that we may not be as good at. And I'm not sure. My ideas are just forming about this, and it'd be so interesting to hear what you think. I'm not sure in terms of what I suppose see in myself in relationship, but also when I'm spending time around therapists, that's necessarily how we think. Also, you could say, how applicable are these principles to relationship? It's very difficult to say what is a strength, what is a weakness. I think generally when therapists are talking to each other, they are very supportive of each other, so they will focus a bit more on strengths rather than necessarily saying that something might be problematic. We have supervision, of course, so it is, at least I'm not a supervisor, but I imagine it's the role of a supervisor that if they notice a pattern or something difficult that's happening, that they will identify that and talk about that and talk with their supervisee about it. On that, with that side of things, though, I suppose my supervisor will only know what I tell them, and I will frame it in the particular way that I want to frame it. Similarly, for most therapists in private practice, nobody else is actually looking. Nobody can see what happens in the room. It's only what we tell somebody else what happens in the room. That's what they know. Anyway, I'd really love to hear what you think about it. Personally, I think it's a very interesting idea for therapists to be thinking about things that they might be doing or not doing, which might sort of adversely affect, I suppose, a connected relationship, because that's what I would be thinking. What would a weakness be? Again, I don't like strengths and weaknesses, but if I had to say what a weakness might be in the concept of a therapeutic relationship, I think I would say it would be being, things that make us more likely to disconnect with clients and make connection more difficult. Dr. Scott talks specifically about empathy as a core competency, for example. And, thinking about it, I don't know that people really talk explicitly about what somebody's empathy is like. During the training, I don't know if anybody gave a specific definition of empathy. Now, I think doing the career, being around people, I think if you didn't have empathy, I think people wouldn't have successful practices. People would find the job and sustaining connected relationships with clients very difficult. Equally, I just think it's a very interesting idea to, for example, think about, what is somebody's empathy like? How do, in terms of the therapist, how do they, and how often do they, and how do they put themselves in the shoes of another person from a feeling point of view? What's that like? I just think those are very helpful questions to ask and to be, again, curious about. So that's quite a lot of talking about it. I hope you agree that these are interesting subjects. As ever, I would love to hear what your comments are. Either send them to me via email or post them, of course, below the video. If you have any ideas for any other subjects that you'd like me to talk about, or anything else you're interested in, of course, let me know that too. In either way, either by comments under the videos or separately via email. Thank you so much for watching. As I said earlier on in the video, please do like the video. If you found it helpful, please do subscribe if you haven't already, and do take care, and I shall see you again soon.